Thanks for everyone for joining today. We're going to go over a lot of questions that were submitted to us in advance first, and then we'll open it up to questions that are additional that any of you might have. And as we're going through any of the questions initially and the submitted questions, feel free, if you have additional questions about that specific material, you can enter that in the chat. And we'll try to address that as we go through. So I'm Valerie Bauza. I am a research associate at the UNC Water Institute, and Ben Tidwell from World Vision will also be presenting with me and answering your questions today as well. So we had a lot of questions come in about the general abstract requirements. So I'll just start with that. And some of you may have found this information on our website, but I'll just help you all navigate through it since there seemed to be a bit of confusion about some of these things and how to submit an abstract. So our conference website is listed on the slide, and I'm gonna switch my screen share. So if you click on the chat, it'll take you to our conference website, and everything is kind of, just sequentially, as you scroll down, you'll find additional information. So if you're looking specifically for the conference requirements or the abstract requirements, you can scroll down to where it says guidelines for submitting abstract, and it'll tell you the deadline, how to submit, what the word count is, and some additional information that you need to know for the abstracts. And when you're actually ready to submit, you can click right up here on the website. It says submit proposal for abstract. So if you click on that, it'll bring up this Google form that you can use in the actual submission process. And again, this has additional information for things that you need to submit. So entering your information for who would be presenting, what's your academic status, your contact information, whether you presented at the conference before, any other abstracts that you might be included on, and then getting into the actual abstract requirements. There's a box for you to enter the title, the actual abstract itself, and then there's a separate box where you can explain what's new or novel about your work. So some people asked about, how to make your abstract stand out or how to make it interesting. And so this box here is really where you can communicate that. And this generally isn't published with the abstract for everyone to see, but it's really your chance to communicate what's new about your work to those that will be reviewing your abstract. Then you can select your presentation type and what categories your abstract falls in. So this will help us guide who should review the abstract and what sessions it should be included in. And you can look through a number of different themes for where yours fits in. And if you don't think it fits into any of the themes, you can also select other and list your themes there. So we had some questions about, what types of categories or areas abstracts are accepted for. And so this is a great place to look for some of the common WASH-related abstracts and presentations that are common at the conference. Okay, so then another question that came up a lot was related to sort of where you could find example abstracts. And these are on the conference website as well. You can click when you're scrolling through the conference website. If you click right here where it's circled, you'll be able to download a PDF of all of the abstracts from last year so that you can read through them to see examples of what abstracts were successful in the past. And if you want to focus on sort of some of the highest scoring ones, there's also a list on the website for the top 20 abstracts from last year. And so you can look at those lists, and within the PDF of the abstracts from last year, you can find specifically the top 20 if you want to look at sort of, what abstracts scored the highest and use those as an example. So our website also has tutorial videos about the abstract writing process. And so some of you may have, already watched these videos. And if you have, some of this might be a bit of a repeat, but we'll try to go maybe a little bit more in depth in this workshop into some of what was said in the tutorial videos. But I recommend watching them if you have additional questions. The first one goes over some of this structure and what to include. And the second one goes over things related to, common reasons that abstracts get rejected from the conference. We recommend breaking your abstract into sections to more clearly communicate the important information. So it's really easy for reviewers to find, exactly what they need to find to be able to score your abstract. So we recommend sections of backgrounds, methods, results, and conclusions. And then going into more detail about what to include in those sections. The background section is really where you should explain why you have done the research. So, provide any background information, establish what the motivation for that research is, and then present the objective of the research. I included an example structure here to give you an idea of sort of the overall length that we would typically expect a background to be given the word length of an abstract, but you don't have to stick explicitly to this example. But it's generally good if you use the first sentence or two to try to introduce that big picture problem and that question, the overall question you're trying to address, and then go into identify the knowledge gap specifically that you're research addressing and give your research objectives so we know clearly why you've done the research and then what you've done or what was the purpose of your research. And then for the methods section, which is the next section, that's really where you want to provide a brief overview of the basic design of your study and the research methods used so that anyone reading your study knows essentially exactly what you did and can evaluate the quality of your research. So you should be describing the type of research that you did. Was it formative research? Was it a randomized controlled trial? Was it a modeling study? And then include also important details of things like what was your sample size? What was the study location? What was the duration? What analytical methods did you use? What were your outcomes? Things of that nature. And then put together, kind of a list of questions that you should try to answer with that method section. Ben, do you want to go over some of these questions in a bit more detail?
Sure. Thanks, Valerie. Yeah, I think so. Just at a high level, I think that often when I've reviewed abstracts in the past, there's a lot of info in the background section. There's a lot of description of the program you're evaluating or something like that. And then they tend to be a little bit lighter on the methods. And I think that, the big high level thing here is, I think a lot of us are used to talking about, the great results we got and not quite as used to the academic environment where it's a little bit more a skeptical kind of critical environment that wants to know, oh, well, were these measures really valid? Are you really able to make these conclusions? And so I think, at a high level, these are some of what I've developed to try to walk through with World Vision staff who are doing this to try to guide kind of the level of detail. And one thing I will say, don't think that every one of these questions needs, multiple sentences or even a sentence to answer it, right? So, you want to know something about the activities done, when they were done, and by whom. But this can be, a sentence or two talking about what the intervention was. The data collected in the design, you don't have to go into incredible detail here. But of course, I find often it's not even called out if there was randomization involved or something like that. What data was collected, you can be very specific here. If there's a, particular, water quality test being evaluated or something like that, or otherwise you can be a bit high level and talk about kinds of the groups of data that you're looking at. Maybe you're looking at demographics and you're looking at sanitation demand measures because that's what you're sort of analyzing. But yeah, I think just at a high level, these are the bits that all kind of need to be there for people to be able to evaluate, do they really, do they believe what you're saying is credible? And again, yeah, you'll see there's a number of questions here. So yeah, I do think in general, more on the methods is really critical when trying to write a conference abstract than perhaps the typical abstract that's submitted. I mean, a lot of these I think are relatively straightforward, but happy to talk about any of them in a little bit more detail.
Great, thanks, Ben. So then, after trying to answer a lot of those questions and putting a lot of meat in the methods section, then it's also important to move on to the results section and really present the main research results. And you should have a lot of details here as well, so we can really understand, what work you've done and how important it is. And if you don't have space for all your results, that's fine, and you can just highlight some of the most important findings related to your conclusion. But if you're able to, if you have any statistical results like p-values, numerical results, about how many people surveyed, how many people, had reached a certain outcome, I think that can be important to include here for the reviewers to evaluate your results. And a lot of times when, abstracts have gotten rejected in the past, it's because either the methods or the results sections don't have enough detail to really understand what's been done in the research and whether or not, it's of high quality or not. And so those are the two sections that I think you want to focus the most on. And then you can have a simple, 2 or 3 sentences for a conclusion that just summarize the main conclusions and key takeaways and gives what can be learned from your research. And try to keep this specific to your research and avoid broad claims that aren't directly supported by your results. Something about just revolutionizing, pit latrines in all these new ways might be a little too broad. And so try to make a conclusion that's specific to what your results are actually saying and how your research can move things forward. Before moving on, well, I guess we can finish this is also related to structure, but there were also questions around how to make an abstract interesting. And that's kind of related to structure, I think, as well. Ben, do you want to go over this?
So yeah, I think this is so this came the high level idea here came from some scientific communication training that that essentially says, yeah, we want this to look almost like an hourglass shape, if that makes sense. So something like broad and big, and what's the problem being addressed. But then yeah, I think a challenge often in abstracts is we try to oversell exactly what we did, and I often try to tell folks that I'm training that the most successful abstract is some balance between how certain we are about the results and how impactful they are. But I think often people assume that, oh, it's got to be something that changes how everyone does sanitation everywhere for all of time, that we kind of know through some associational data. But it's often quite the opposite. That's something that's very well identified, something that's very credibly demonstrated, even if it's just for a certain context with maybe some potential implications elsewhere, is going to be quite strong. And so starting broad, talking about the large problem to be solved, but keeping in mind this is a water and health conference. You don't need to give 10 JMP statistics in your abstract. Please don't. It will be wasted space. But talk about why this is important, but then get really into the details of what exactly you found. But then do go out and say what are the implications for this? Again, trying to balance this with, you don't want to say we found this in this place in this time and therefore sanitation is revolutionized, but do be thoughtful about this, right? There may be similar contexts where this is relevant. There may be, whether we're talking about, geographies or levels of income or some other things, but the more you can thoughtfully take that narrow result from your one study in one place and think about how it might influence others, the clearer it's going to be. And one of the scoring criteria is around how important is this issue and how valuable is it to the sector. And so doing that well, I think, is quite important.
Great. So before we move on to answering some of the other questions, just want to check if anyone has any questions kind of about how to structure the abstract or what to include that are remaining. If you want to put them in the chat or raise your hand just so we can address those before we move on. Okay, so one question came up in the chat, do you include references in conference abstracts? Typically, I would say no. There could be extreme cases about something really specific where you may include one reference, but in general, you wouldn't need to include any references in an abstract. And kind of that first background, 1 or 2 sentences can be fairly broad speaking generally, where you shouldn't need a specific reference because it might be a problem, that's talked about across several papers or several things. So it's not necessarily you're referring to one specific, reference that you're building on. Any other questions or anything related to structure or abstract contents? Okay. If they come up, we can address them later, but I'll move on to sort of the next question that was asked the most frequently, which was really how to write an abstract on work that is currently in progress. Because the submission deadline is in May and the conference isn't until October, so there's still plenty of time to finish analysis, or even if there's some field work going on that may complete before the conference. And so this is a pretty common scenario. And it's definitely okay to submit an abstract for work that's still in progress, as long as you expect it to be completed and have results to present at the conference. And so a general recommendation, I think, for how to do this is just that you can, structure your intro and your method sections similar to how we just recommended. And then in your results section, if you have some preliminary results, you can present those, and this will kind of allow reviewers to understand like what types of results are expected. And if you have information, about how far along you are and what you expect the timeline to be, you can present that as well. So say, preliminary results from this, the first round of data collection indicate this, the second round of data collection will complete May 30th, and, we expect results by X date, so that we feel confident, that there will be results ready to present for the conference. And then in the conclusion section, you can highlight again any conclusions from preliminary findings, or you could suggest kind of what you expect your results could allow you to make conclusions about. And so that's kind of a general recommendation for how you could write an abstract on work that's in progress. If you download, the examples from last year, I'm sure you'll see some specific examples about, how it's been done in specific contexts. Ben, do you have any tips kind of to add related to this point about in progress work?
Yeah, just a couple of things. So, I mean, first, sorry. All right. Am I still echoing? No, I think not. Okay. Yeah, just a couple of notes. I mean, one, so that if you're considering this, you don't think that you're alone in this. I think probably over the years, half of the abstracts I've submitted have been, maybe pretty significantly still in progress. I would say though, balancing that, like, if you think you're going to get results like, oh, it'll be like end of September, like that'll get delayed and it'll be, so be a bit reasonable with that. But I think really the critical thing here, I feel like people always feel a bit awkward to write in like, oh, and we hope we'll get results, and probably we'll see that there was this huge impact, and and things like that. Don't try to make up results that you don't have yet. In fact, in scientific journals lately, there have been even papers that are accepted based entirely on pre-analysis plans. So you present your design and your analysis, and if it is important enough, then whether or not there's an impact of this intervention or not is deemed not as relevant for determining whether they're accepted. And so if the background makes a compelling case for the importance of the topic, and the methods show clearly that there's a rigorous design and careful data collection, and give maybe even a little bit more detail about the analysis plan in the method section and that sort of case, because you're not going to have as much put in the results section if you don't have results. But I would say don't shy away from that. But again, a bit within reason. There's nothing quite as disappointing as going to a presentation where the abstract promises the world, and then people say, well, actually, we just have some kind of exploratory data. So yeah, just balancing that, but realizing it's far from rare that's how abstracts are submitted.
I agree. Like, many of my abstracts have been work that's still in progress as well. I think that's a very common thing. And often, maybe I have some results from formative research and I'm waiting on like a quantitative data collection round to complete, and I might just tease some of the qualitative results about, some of the things we expect we might find, and go into that. And so if you have some of those kind of preliminary results, and that way you can put that there too. But a good analysis plan, like Ben said, also works well for this. If anyone has any questions on this point, I know this came up a lot, so if there's remaining questions, please feel free to share them in the chat or raise your hand. In the meantime, I'm just gonna read one of the questions that was added, I think, about the abstract submission form that I went over earlier, so we can answer that. And so someone asked that there's a section in the application form where it asks if the same abstract is submitted in other platforms, does it have negative implication for an abstract to compete here if it's submitted in other similar platforms? No, it doesn't. Like, that information's not actually shared with the reviewers that are reviewing the abstract. That's just, for, I think, some of the conference organizers, like internal information to get a sense of the other places that this kind of work is being presented at. So you can feel free to share that without concern that it'll negatively affect your score. Okay, great. So then, okay. So yeah, if there's not any other questions about this, then a lot of the other questions that were submitted were fairly specific to one or two people, and I felt that we could go over them now because they might be questions that affect, other people that could be learned from. If you have other specific questions, feel free to put them in the chat. And if we get through all of the questions, then I think Ben and I might go over some of the example abstracts and just look at, okay, here's my method section from last year. Like, Ben, how would you improve that? Or kind of do some back and forth. And we'll start with maybe our own before we go into random people's. But yeah, please share any questions that you have in the chat, and we'll kind of go over some of these random questions. I don't have slides prepared for them because they're quite specific. But we'll give our thoughts on this. So the first question was, when submitting an abstract, how much is too much theory and how much is not enough empirical results? And so I think we touched on this a bit already when we went through kind of, how to sort of like what you should be including in the intro, like how much to include there versus say in your results. And I think you want to focus a lot on sort of, what your results are, and you can touch on, it depends on the type of the research, but I would say touch on a bit of the theory, but really try to emphasize the empirical results more so it's clear, what you actually did in your work. And within your presentation, you can go into a bit of the theory a lot, but, as the audience is other WASH practitioners and researchers, a lot of them already will know a lot of the theory that your work is based on. So it's really important to kind of present the specific results from your research in that way. Do you have anything to kind of add to that, Ben, for that question?
Yeah, sure. So I'm a behavioral scientist, so this question is near and dear to my heart because I love theory. And I think the most helpful way I can frame this, especially for this conference, but for abstracts in general, I think is, yeah, the tendency I've seen, especially a lot in practitioners, is to phrase things as if they're like an impact evaluation of a project, like this approach by this NGO did this, and that has a place in the sector and in marketing and things like that. But often, no one's going to take World Vision's approach X and just use it everywhere, or CARES or WaterAids or whatever, most likely. The question is really, okay, well, okay, that was a community mobilization intervention, but it also used, this sort of thing from social science, this sort of small group collective action approach or something like that. And I think where the theory is most helpful is in making that extrapolation to other settings, like I talked about early. So you might want to have just in the background, like, there's been this question about sanitation, and often we've used this kind of approach, but what about using collective action rather than a social norms intervention? And then you've got empirical results that say that, and then say, this, because it aligns with this theory, here's a way that it can be, made applicable other places. I certainly wouldn't rehash theoretical debates in your background or anything like that. I almost wouldn't. unless incredibly important or somehow nuanced or different from the norms, I wouldn't even really define terms there, because again, your abstract is going to be reviewed by people with that narrow area of focus. And then in your presentation, you'll have opportunity to define key terms and things like that. So yeah, I think that's the high level advice I would give.
Great. Okay, there's a question in the chat, I think, about work in progress. So I have a paper that will be published in the next 3 weeks and another piece of work in progress. I plan to only submit an abstract for the work in progress since I thought the published paper will already be too old in October. Would you agree with this, or should I try with the published paper as well? In my opinion, I think that if you haven't already presented a published paper at a conference like this or to a similar audience, and it's just published and the results are still, things that the sector would be interested in, I think you can try to submit both. Because I found, doing a presentation on a published paper can help raise awareness of that paper and let more people know, hey, this really interesting paper is out there, and they might not have seen the paper yet. And so doing that presentation might, help disseminate that information and get more people to look at that paper and then use that research. But if you presented that paper, already last year at this conference or at a similar conference, then I would only focus on the new work, because it's not interesting, for people to see the same presentation year after year. But it definitely can help, get more eyes on your work, presenting it, even if it's already published. Okay. Those questions were already asked. Okay, so the next question that was submitted. Okay. After complying with the editorial guidelines of a journal, how can a novice writer like myself make the abstract interesting for it to be accepted in conference? So I think we touched on this a lot when we gave some recommendations for, how to structure it. But it's really kind of like making it that hourglass shape that Ben talked about, and maybe bringing in some more of, I think, the specific methods and the results than you may have for a journal, to try to sort of highlight some of those different things. So making sure, with a paper, anyone can open up your paper and look at some of those methods. And so it's less important to put some of those details, I think, in your paper abstract. But here, this abstract is the only information that a reviewer has to review the quality of your work. And so you want to make sure that they have enough of your methods and enough of your results to evaluate what you actually did and the quality of that work. And so I think that might, it depends a bit on the editorial guidelines of that specific journal, how you would actually need to revise it, because different journals have different guidelines. But that would be kind of my general advice there. Ben, do you have anything you might add to that?
Yeah, just to say, I think I understand certainly the worry about making it interesting, and maybe a related issue that may or may not be in view from the question submitter here, in terms of language is a barrier, or trying to write so everything's really easy to read. I mean, of course, spend the time that you can to make it easy to read. But I mean, I would say just know that at least the reviewers I'm familiar with, if it's a little bit hard to follow the grammar in some of the sentences, it's really not near as important as getting some of those technical details right. We can read between the lines to see what, if we know kind of what the methods are and what the measures are that are being taken and that sort of thing. I wouldn't worry about making it interesting by having this isn't a TED talk. You're not trying to come up with this, really interesting introduction or this oversold conclusion about anything. I mean, how it makes it interesting is, highly reliable knowledge about how to solve an important problem. I think that's the key here. So I wouldn't worry about anything other than just kind of the guidance we've shared a little bit earlier.
Great. So then, The next question I think kind of fits with that. So how do you suggest tailoring our abstracts to this audience? And I think it, similar to what we've already said, like focusing on WASH researchers, WASH practitioners, like what is the work that you've done, like clearly explaining what the work you've done, what did you evaluate, what are your results? And I think that that's what people want to know. They want to know the quality of your work and what you've been doing. And so you don't have to focus, and these are experts in the field, and so you don't have to focus so much on building up that background situation, or like Ben said, putting 5 JMP statistics in there. It's really focusing on the meat of your research, the methods, the results, kind of getting that across. Any other comments on that, Ben?
So I don't know if you can see me. I was giving a thumbs up. That's okay. No, I think that's
sorry. I had to like make the video smaller so I could see the actual words on the slide. Okay,
good. No. Yeah, good for my side.
Okay. Okay, so then the next question was, when writing abstracts, do you have to use the full name of the pathogen that you're researching on, or you can only use abbreviations? And so in general, I think the rule of thumb tends to be like, you can put in the full name, but it's also generally accepted, I think, to just use the first initial for this. So it would be like M period, tuberculosis, and then you can put in parentheses MTB and then use MTB and the rest of it, or you can use the full name once and then put MTB in parentheses, but you should at some, in some way introduce the full name. And so like just saying E. coli is fine. And so you don't necessarily have to put both full words there, but I would introduce it before you go into an abbreviation. Okay. Okay, so then the next question is, what is the basis for a decision for a verbal or poster presentation? And so I think that this can be, I think there's 2 separate questions here. So I'm not entirely sure if the person was asking how we decide, like how they're scored separately for verbal or poster, or how they should decide if they should present for a poster or a verbal. But generally, if you have work that's just starting out and you don't think you'll have necessarily as comprehensive of results, then maybe a poster might be a better fit, like for you personally. But generally, a verbal is recommended to get, I think, the most attention. But it also depends on how you want feedback, because during a verbal session, you're going to have a lot of people listening at once, and there's the Q&A session, and there may be discussions afterwards. But at a poster, you kind of have people coming up one at a time, and so you can have some of that one-on-one conversation. If you really are hoping for one-on-one feedback from a number of people, that could fit well for you. But in general, when you submit your abstract, you can select your preference. So preference for a verbal, a preference for a poster, or like no preference for both. And the way that they're scored by reviewers, if you say you have no preference, the highest scores will get the slots for the verbal presentations, and then the lower scores that are accepted then move to a poster. So a verbal talk is generally considered like more prestigious than a poster talk, but based on your situation, it's not everyone always prefers the verbal. So there could be some, specific cases where a poster presentation could be a better fit for you and your research personally. Any thoughts to add to that, Ben?
Yeah, I think that's a great summary. I think the default is to always go towards verbal presentations. And I think, especially when you're talking about kind of broad range of impacts or trying to have influence, that totally makes sense. I do think the one situation which you brought up a little bit, Valerie, is wanting detailed feedback on either something that maybe is a bit more niche of an idea, or that is earlier in the process. And so, if you're early on as a grad student or in a project even, to have a poster and to specifically invite, 2 or 3 people to come there and have a little mini presentation or mini discussion might be more useful. I would say, yeah, no one presentation is going to make or break anything in terms of your future as a scientist. So use it to get whatever feedback is most useful to you and your work. Yeah.
Yeah, and I have seen some people before at this conference that do posters, and they might have actually printouts of their paper there that they're handing out, or they have like little handouts of like, contact me. I'm looking for these kinds of collaborators, you can contact me. And so if you're walking by, the posters are set up all day. So people are walking by and they like have that feedback, and the presenter's not there, they can always like grab those handouts. So there's a lot of ways like that that you might be able to get some feedback if you have a poster presentation in person. Um, Hopefully it will be in person, I think, this year. But so those are, some results on that. So if there's further questions on that, feel free to put it in the chat. The next question was if there are any fees to pay. And so for this, there's no fees for submitting an abstract. Depending on, I think, if this ends up being an in-person conference or a hybrid or remote this year. I'm not sure if the final decision on that has been made, but if it is in person, then there tends to be fees for actually, registering for the conference in person, which includes all of your meals and things of that nature. I think, there's resources available to cover some of those costs. I'm not sure that that information has been provided yet, but if you're coming for an in-person conference and you need any assistance with some of those fees, definitely be on the lookout for future emails or on the conference website for potential assistance with some of that. But as far as submitting an abstract, there's no fees to submit. So you can submit abstracts for any of your work, and you can decide later. You can always turn down an acceptance if you decide like, oh, I won't actually be able to present it. So you shouldn't, there's no concern just about cost to submit. Is my country eligible? Yeah, there's no eligibility requirements for countries, so you can submit from any countries, so there's no concerns there. And so the next two questions I think were kind of similar. So someone asked if there could be a group presentation, and also if the presenter necessarily needs to be the lead author. And if there's any kind of ways for co-author, I think, papers or abstracts that multiple people could present at once. And so typically one person will present. It's not always, say, the lead author on the paper. Like sometimes it might make sense for someone else to present that paper or that presentation or that poster, just depending on maybe the second author will be available at the conference and the first author won't. And so someone else may present it. There have been some instances of like a group presentation where two people are at a poster presenting or two people are presenting at a verbal talk as well. So it's not a requirement necessarily that it can only be one person presenting. That tends to be I think, logistically the easiest, at least for a verbal presentation, to have, one person going through the presentation and other people that are in the audience that can also answer questions during the Q&A about the presentation. But there have been some, that where two people may be presenting, and especially for a poster, you can have multiple people from the project there presenting the poster for those discussions. Any other thoughts on that, Ben, about, I don't know if you've had experience kind of co-presenting anything?
Yeah, no, I think that's great. Yeah, I appreciate the impulse to have multiple people presenting on a verbal presentation. It often becomes a time issue. And yeah, so I mean, I would just say consider that. I think what Valerie suggested in terms of having a presenter and people present to answer questions either during Q&A or after the session is what I've seen work best in the past. But again, feel free to propose and try to execute what makes most sense for you.
Yeah, and make sure, and just like to note, like for the person presenting, they should be a co-author of the work. So it should be someone who is involved with the work and like co-author the paper or the abstract. So it shouldn't be, just someone from your organization that had nothing to do with the work, because we want, obviously someone who can discuss the work and answer any questions. Yeah, okay, great. So if there's other questions on that as well, feel free to put them in the chat. So the next question was asking about the best way to come up with a title. So I think that there's there's a lot, I think, of different approaches to this. Like I've worked with a lot of different people, and kind of almost everyone I would say has a different almost thought of how to come up with a title or what makes a good title. Personally, I like a title that alludes to or presents like kind of almost the main result, or at least talks about the type of research it was. So is it formative research? Is it exploratory research? Is it a cross-sectional study? Is it a randomized controlled trial? So like making that clear in the title, I think is really helpful. And then like putting in the, the keywords about what you did. And so it can be the main result if you have a result, like, sanitation is associated with diarrhea, a cross-sectional study, kind of going into what's the result and what's the type of study. That's one way to do it, but it can also, be something related, just describing your research. So if it's, formative research related to child play spaces in rural Ethiopia, you can kind of explain that in the title. And so it should just be, from reading the title, having an understanding of what type of work you did. So like, what was the type of study, and what are you generally focused on? But I don't think that there's necessarily one right way to write a title, because lots of different people I know have different opinions on this. What do you think, Ben?
Yeah, no, I think you're saying that there's a lot of opinions on this is right on. Yeah, I think in my experience, even just reading through abstract books, trying to figure out which presentations to attend, not even just like scoring or something, because that, honestly, like the title's not that relevant for the scoring of the abstract, whether or not it gets accepted. I think we see the titles, but that's like not like we're reading the whole abstract, so it more or less doesn't matter. I think you want to say like, what is the thing you were testing? How did you test it? And are there contextual variables that might affect whether it's interesting to people? So, if something differs in a rural versus urban context, great. If you can put the country, if it's something policy related or social sciencey, that's great. I won't take a hard stance on whether you should avoid having, wash puns in your little main title. But yeah, it just makes it harder to find what the actual thing's about often. But I can't say you shouldn't do that. But yeah, I do think at least alluding to what the finding is. Again, it doesn't have to be like this has a statistically significant increase in this key outcome, but like
something is associated with something.
The impact of something on something, a cross-sectional study in peri-urban Zambia, or something like that is I think, less is more, as long as you are communicating those key details. I do think often, the impact of this, comma, this, comma, this, comma, this, comma, and this, like you don't need that level of detail. But yeah, again, some of these are just maybe some opinions to keep in mind.
Yeah, and I would say, but I don't think reviewers, like Ben said, I don't think reviewers are necessarily scoring your abstract based on the title, but I think the title is important for getting the people you want to come to your presentation. And so for people to be able to evaluate, is this presentation relevant to me? Like, should I go to it at the actual conference? I think that's what the title is even more important for. So, who's going to come to your poster, who's going to come to your verbal? Your title is kind of the way to draw them in, I think. And so Sarah just noted in the chat, before you sign off, like there's a quick survey to fill out, and she put a link. So if you want to just click on that and give some feedback, that would be much appreciated while we go through some of the remaining questions. Okay, so someone asked how to make sure I have given relevant and most important results. And I think, I think that, what's the most important result might be subjective based on what areas people work in. But in general, you want to give the results that are most relevant to the conclusions you're trying to draw from the research, or what the outcomes you were actually trying to investigate were. So if you designed a study to investigate a main outcome, you want to give the results for that main outcome in your abstract. And if there's a key one or two secondary outcomes that you were looking for, or specific factors you might have been exploring, like what were the main factors you were exploring in your formative research or things like that. So kind of going to your study design and thinking about what are the main things we were looking for. I think those are some of the most important things to include in your results. What do you think, Ben?
Yeah, I'd agree with all that. I think the only thing that so often I think we're tempted in abstracts or in presentations to try to cover, everything from sort of complicated studies. And I can think, for example, there was a sanitation trial I was involved in where we could either have talked about kind of main results. Did this market-based approach lead to more uptake? But maybe the more interesting result was around gender and around gender equity, and trying to put both of those in a compelling way in an abstract is a bit challenging. And even trying to put them in a presentation, if it's just like one table kind of on each, and that's totally fine. But I think in our case is zeroing in on the sort of gender equity issues and placing it in that literature and that background rather than market-based sanitation background made sense. And so I think some of it is just kind of judging what are the results and what do they speak to that, and is that relevant to a particular sort of sub-technical area of WASH or a cross-cutting issue or something like that. But I think that's hopefully you can get some of that before coming to the conference. Some of it would be at the conference to see the kind of questions people are asking. Often people will zero in on one part of one slide and all your Q&A would be on that, and that's pretty good indication that's a way to go with your paper and research.
Yeah, that's great. And that's like something that I've found helpful before is like, what do people ask questions about and are most interested in, to then be like, oh, I need to address these things in my paper that I'm working on. And so that's a great thing that you can get from a presentation. So I got another question in the chat, and I'm going to direct this probably to you first, Ben, because I think this is maybe something you have the most experience with, but it's, what recommendations do you have for submitting an abstract on a qualitative study?
Yeah, sure. So, full disclosure, I'm primarily a quantitative researcher, but I do quite a bit of exploratory qualitative work around formative research and things like that. I think a couple of notes I would indicate. I think what everyone fears from going to a qualitative presentation is that it's going to be sort of just a couple of anecdotes and then some sort of overblown conclusions drawn from that. And so I think in light of that, what's really important from my perspective is to see, one, was there some, sort of a solid theoretical framework behind what's being asked? Is there like something behind this, or is it just kind of a list of questions that came up? And then two is the analytical approach. I think often qualitative work in particularly in WASH, I can say, a lot of papers end up being just sort of like a thematic summary of what people said, and maybe the state of the research merits that. Maybe it's a very early on investigation, and so even just having some data to show is quite relevant. But I think when I've had success is saying like, okay, we used the social ecological model to try to assess what were the levels at which these sort of things were happening, and so there's some specification of an approach that was taken there. And I think in the results, there's not enough room to put in quotes or anything like that, but to get a little bit more detail than, we found that these 4 things were the biggest issues, and then just listing them, right? Like to try to specify what was interesting and unique that people might not understand. Again, it's really hard. It's hard to boil down qualitative research into a paper. It's certainly hard to boil it down into an abstract, but to show that there's been some thoughtful approach to the sort of questionnaire or the research design and the analysis, and to share some nuance of the findings. Don't think that you have to pack everything in there to convince people of all the results. Again, it's essentially just trying to convince people that this is enough of interest that it should be accepted and they should come listen to it. It's not like your paper abstract, which maybe the only thing anyone ever reads of your paper. You're always told. So it's just a little bit different than that in terms of balancing the content.
Yeah, great. Thanks. I agree with all of that. And I know we only have a few minutes left, so I want to, like, we have a couple other questions on here to go through, but I want to open it up to see if anyone has any other questions for people remaining, if they want to raise their hand with any questions, or if there's anything in the chat um, before I move on, just so folks have a chance, if they have specific questions, to get those answered. And if you don't, okay, there's one. Okay. Yeah, so if you don't know how to raise your hand, also there's, I actually can't find how to do it on my screen, so I don't know how to give the instructions. But there should be like a reaction, raise hand if that's something that you want, or if you need to put anything in the chat. But otherwise, I guess we can just maybe answer one more question.
Yeah, it is under reactions, raise hand. Maybe it just doesn't show since you're presenting.
It probably doesn't show for me because I'm presenting.
It makes
okay.
sense. You shouldn't be able to raise your hand or it would be not needed.
Right. Okay, so then I think we've covered this a lot, but this might be a good place maybe to end on if there aren't any other specific questions, which are kind of what are the main factors for a successful abstract and what are common reasons for abstracts that are not accepted. And so I think main factors for a successful abstract are a lot of what we talked about, like demonstrating that you have, well-conducted research with clear results that you'll be presenting on the conference. And if it's anything, that's in an area I think that the field is particularly interested in, or something that is new or novel, I think that that will, make it more likely to be successful. But common reasons things are presented are rejected is that, like, from the results and the methods, I think it's just not clear what is being done, if there's anything evaluated. And so it's fairly common to get abstracts that just kind of describe a program that an NGO might have implemented, but it's not clear, if there's any, like, what, like, if the program's effectiveness was evaluated, or like if there's data that was collected about people's reactions to it. Is sort of like, here's a program that was done, but it's unclear kind of what might be presented about it, or the whole abstract might be background information. And so it's really important to include, if there's data from surveys, if there's specific methods of evaluation, things of that nature, because I think a lot of times when the abstracts are getting submitted, it's because of those lack of details. Ben, do you have things that you might want to add to that from reviewing abstracts?
Yeah, no, I think that's all right on. Yeah, I think the biggest thing that I've seen is, especially when it's folks that are outside of kind of the research community and trying to figure out how to submit something, is it is a little bit too much focused on the programmatic details and not, what is important for others. So not, NGO X's approach to this, increase something by 20%, but, the use of this technique using this theory led to this sort of result in this kind of context is the main thing. The flip side of that is, you could certainly be too much on the academic side, so that you sort of talk about, a problem that was developed and almost entirely just from the literature, and talking about just the usefulness there. This is an academic conference, but yeah, some helping the reviewers to know what the likely importance is really important. I mean, the people that will be reviewing them are expert in this topic area, but if you have a really a really specialized water quality test on something that's very novel, you want to make sure that that people aren't struggling to understand, what does this actually mean. Yeah, I think that's all for mine.
Yeah, and sometimes reviewers also sometimes complain about, like, the overall writing, and they may have trouble finding some of the information that they need. And so I think, just as like a tip in general, try to have someone else read it who's removed from the project or something like that, to make sure that it can be clearly understood by someone who doesn't understand exactly what you're talking about. Because sometimes, like, a co-author knows all the details, and so just like, it's great to have a co-author review it, but if you can have someone outside of the project also review it to make sure they understand, like, what you're actually doing and that it clearly comes out, I think that can be helpful as well. And there's just one more question I think that came up in the chat. Kata, I don't know, maybe you can answer this, but they asked roughly how many abstracts are normally selected for a verbal and poster presentation versus sort of how many are submitted overall.
Right, we usually get well over 400 to 500 submissions for abstracts, and then we select usually the top 60 to 80 for verbals. And then we have up to an additional 80 to 100 for posters. And it just depends on the conference venue and how many spots we have available based on the number of rooms we have and concurrent sessions. But generally speaking, up to 60 verbals and then up to 80 posters, depending on the year.
Great,
Good
thanks.
question. Yep.
Yeah, great question. Thanks. Yeah, so I think that's wait, one more question. Okay, I think that's all the time we have today. Thanks for submitting your questions. If you have other questions, feel free to reach out to us at waterinstitute@unc.edu. And you can also visit the conference website. A lot of the information that we've gone over is posted there, and you can get answers to your questions there. And I think we'll also be posting probably the video from today's workshop there as well. If you missed, anything from the beginning and have additional questions, you should be able to watch it there. So thank you all so much for joining us, and good luck with your submissions.
Yes, thanks everyone. Good luck.